Now listen to this, Boron. We'll assume that the grazel is the cup that held the wine our Lord blessed. How could Joseph of Arimathea collect the blood from the crucified Christ if, when he takes Jesus down from the cross, our Savior was already dead, and, as you know, the dead don't bleed? Even dead, Jesus could work miracles. It wasn't a cup, Kayat interrupted, because the man who told me the story about Pherephis also revealed that it was a stone fallen from the sky, lapis ex chelis, and if it was a cup it's because it was carved from this celestial stone. Then why wasn't it the tip of the spear that pierced the holy bosom? The poet asked. Didn't you say earlier that you saw an attendant carrying a bleeding spear? Well, what I see is not one but 3 attendants, each with a spear from which blood is streaming. And then a man dressed like a bishop with a cross in his hand, borne on a chair by 4 angels, who put him down before the silver table where the spear now lies. Then 2 maidens carrying a charger with a man's severed head on it, bathed in blood. And then the bishop who is officiating over the spear. He raises the host, and in the host the image of a babe can be seen. The spear is the portentous object, and it is a sign of power because it's a sign of strength. No, the spear drips blood, but the drops fall into a cup, demonstrating the miracle I was talking about, Boron said. It's so simple, and he began to smile. That's enough, buandulino said, dejected. Let's forget about the grazel and go on. My friends, Rabbi Solomon said, with the detachment of a man who, being Jewish, was not greatly impressed by that sacred relic. To have the priest immediately make a gift of that significance seems exaggerated to me. And then, the reader of the letter could ask Frederick to display this wonder. All the same, we can't exclude the possibility that the stories heard by Kayat and by Boron are in circulation in many regions, and so a hint would be enough, and a word to the wise would suffice. Don't write grazel, don't write cup, use a less precise term.
The Torah never refers to the most sublime things in a literal sense, but in a secret sense, so the devout reader must gradually guess what the Almighty, always may his holy name be blessed, wanted to be understood at the end of time. Buandulino suggested. Let's say then that he is sending a casket, a coffer, an ark. Let's say Axape Istam Verum Arkham, except this true ark. Not bad, Rabbi Solomon said. It conceals and reveals at the same time.
And it opens the path to the vortex of interpretation. They continued writing.
If you would deign to come to our dominions, we would consider you the greatest and the most worthy member of our court, and you could enjoy all our riches.
With these, which are abundant among us, you shall be then heaped if you choose to return to your empire. Remember you must die, and you will never sin. After this pious recommendation, the priest went on to describe his power. No humility, Abdul urged. The priest stands so high that he can allow himself some haughtiness. Indeed. Buandulino had no qualms, and he dictated. That Dominus Dominatium surpassed in power all the kings of the earth, and his wealth was infinite. 72 kings paid him tribute, 72 provinces obeyed him, even if not all were Christian, and so Rabbi Solomon was satisfied, as they placed in the kingdom also the lost tribes of Israel. His sovereignty extended over the 3 Indias, his territories reached the most remote deserts, as far as the Tower of Babel. Every month, at the king's table, 7 kings were served, 62 dukes, and 365 counts, and every day at that same table were seated 12 archbishops, 10 bishops, the Patriarch of St. Thomas, the Protopapas of Samarkand, and the Archprotopapas of Susa. Isn't that too many? Solomon asked. No, no, the poet said, we have to make the Pope spit green, and the Basileus of Byzantium, too. And add that the priest has made a vow to visit the Holy Sepulchre with a great army to defeat the enemies of Christ. This will confirm what Otto said about him, and it will shut the Pope's mouth if by any chance he points out that John never managed to cross the Ganges. John is ready to try again, for this reason it's worth going to find him and forming an alliance with him. Now give me some ideas about populating the kingdom, Buandulino said. It has to have elephants, dromedaries, camels, hippopotamuses, panthers, onagers, white and red lions, mute cicadas, griffins, tigers, llamas, hyenas, all the things we never see in our countries, and whose remains are precious for those who decide to go and hunt down there. And also men never seen, but spoken of in books on the nature of things in the universe. Centaurs, horned men, fawns, satyrs, pygmies, cynocephala, giants 40 cubits tall, one-eyed men, Kayat suggested. Good, good, right, Abdul, write it down, Buandulino said. For the rest, they had only to repeat what had been thought and said in previous years, with some embellishments. The land of Prester John dripped honey and was brimming with milk, and Rabbi Solomon was delighted to find echoes of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. The land knew neither serpents nor scorpions, the river Phison flowed there, which emerges directly from the earthly paradise, and in the land were found stones and sand, Kayat suggested. No, Rabbi Solomon replied, that's the Sambadion. Shouldn't we put the Sambadion in here, too? Yes, but later. The Physon flows from the earthly paradise and therefore contains emeralds, topaz, carbuncles, sapphires, chrysolite, onyx, beryls, amethysts. Kayod contributed. He had just arrived and didn't understand why his friends displayed signs of nausea. If you give me one more topaz I'll swallow it, then shit it out the window, Buandulino cried. By now, with the countless blessed islands and paradises they had visited in the course of their research, they were all fed up with precious stones. Abdul then proposed, since the kingdom was in the east, to name rare spices, and they chose pepper. Of which Boron said that it grows on trees infested with snakes, and when it is ripe you set fire to the trees and the snakes escape and hide in their lairs. Then you approach the tree, shake it, the pepper falls from the branches, and you cook it in some process that nobody knows. Now can we put the sambadi on? Solomon asked. Oh, go ahead, the poet said, then it's clear that the 10 lost tribes are on the other side of the river. Yes, let's mention them explicitly, so Frederick can also find the lost tribes and add another gem to his crown. Abdul observed that the Sambadion was necessary because it was the insuperable obstacle that thwarts the will and heightens desire. In other words, jealousy. Someone proposed also mentioning an underground stream rich in precious stones, but he refused to pursue the idea, for fear of hearing someone say topaz again. On the testimony of Pliny and Isidore, they decided instead to place salamanders in those lands, snakes with 4 legs that live amid flames. It only has to be true and we'll include it, Buandulino said, so long as we're not telling fairy tales. The letter continued, insisting for a while on the virtue that reigned in those lands, where every pilgrim was welcomed with charity, no one was poor, there were no thieves, predators, misers, or flatterers. The priest then declared that he believed there was no monarch in the world so rich or with so many subjects. To offer proof of these riches, which for that matter Sindbad had seen at Serendib, there was then the great scene where the priest described himself as he went to war against his enemies, preceded by 13 crosses studded with jewels, each on a chariot, each chariot followed by 10,000 horsemen and 100,000 foot soldiers. When, on the contrary, the priest rode out in peacetime, he was preceded by a wooden cross, recalling the passion of the Lord, and by a golden pot filled with earth, to remind everyone, and himself, that dust we are and unto dust we shall return. But so no one would forget that he who was passing was still the King of Kings, here was another silver pot filled with gold. If you put in any topaz, I'll smash this jug over your head, Buandulino warned. And Abdul, that time at least, omitted topaz. Write also that, down there, no adulterers exist, and no one can lie, and that anyone who lies dies that instant, or it's as if he died, because he is outlawed and no one pays any further heed to him. I've already written that there are no vices, no thieves. That's all right, insist. The kingdom of Prester John must be a place where Christians succeed in keeping the divine commandments, while the Pope has not managed to achieve anything similar with his children. Indeed he himself lies, and worse than others. Anyway, insisting on the fact that nobody lies there, we make it self-evident that everything John says is true. John continued, saying that every year he paid a visit, with a great army, to the tomb of the prophet Daniel in deserted Babylon, that in his country fish were caught whose blood was the source of purple, and that he exercised his sovereignty over the Amazons and the Brahmins. The Brahmin idea seemed useful to Boron because the Brahmins had been seen by Alexander the Great when he reached the most extreme Orient imaginable. Hence their presence proved that in the kingdom of the priest was incorporated the very empire of Alexander. At this point nothing remained but to describe his palace and his magic mirror, and on this score the poet had already said everything some evenings earlier. But he remembered it, whispering into Abdul's ear, so that Buandulino would hear no more talk of topaz, which clearly were required in this case. I believe that a future reader, Rabbi Solomon said, will wonder why such a powerful king had himself called only priest. True, and this allows us to arrive at the conclusion, Buandulino said. Abdul, right. Why, O most beloved Frederick, our sublimity does not grant us an appellative more worthy than that of presbyter is a question that does honor to your wisdom. To be sure, at our court we have ministers on whom are conferred duties and names far more worthy, especially where the ecclesiastical hierarchy is concerned. Our dispenser is primate and king and archbishop our wine steward, king and archimandrite our blacksmith, king and abbot our chief cook. So then our own highness, unwilling to be designated with these same titles, or to receive the same orders in which our court abounds, in humility determined to be called by a less important name, of a lower rank. For the moment suffice it for you to know that our territory extends in one direction a distance of 4 months' march, whereas in the other direction no one knows how far it reaches. If you could number the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea, then you could measure our possessions and our power. It was almost daybreak when our friends finished the letter. Those who had taken the honey were still in a state of smiling stupefaction. Those who had drunk only wine were tipsy. The poet, who had again tasted both substances, could hardly stand. They walked, singing, through the narrow streets and the squares, touching that parchment with reverence, now convinced that it had just arrived from the kingdom of Prester John. Did you send it at once to Reynald? Nikitas asked. No, after the poet left, we reread it for months and polished it, scraping and rewriting many times. Every now and then someone would suggest a little addition. But Reynald was expecting the letter, I imagine. The fact is that meantime Frederick had removed Reynald from the position of Chancellor of the Empire, which he gave then to Christian of Book. To be sure, Reynald, as Archbishop of Cologne, was also Arch-Chancellor of Italy, and he remained very powerful, so much so that it was still he who organized the canonization of Charlemagne. But that replacement, at least in my view, meant that Frederick had begun to feel Reynald was too aggressive. So how could we present to the emperor a letter that, after all, had been desired by Reynald? I was forgetting. In the same year as the canonization, Beatrice had a second son, and so the emperor had other things on his mind, also because, according to rumors I heard, the first child was always sickly. So, what with one thing and another, more than a year went by. Reynald didn't insist. At first he also had other things on his mind. Then he died. While Frederick was in Rome to expel Alexander III and put his antipope on the throne, a pestilence broke out, and the plague takes the rich and the poor alike. So Reynald died. I was shaken, even though I had never really loved him. He was arrogant and rancorous, but he had been a bold man and had fought to the end for his master. Rest his soul. But at this point, without him, did the letter still make any sense? He was the only one sufficiently clever to know how to profit by it, having it circulate among the chancelleries of all the Christian world. Buandulino paused. Besides, there was the question of my city. What city? You were born in a swamp. That's true. I'm going too fast. We still have to build the city. At last you're telling me about a city that's not destroyed. Yes, Buandulino said, it was the first and only time in my life that I would see a city's birth and not its death. 13. Buandulino sees the birth of a new city. 10 years had gone by since Buandulino came to Paris. He had read everything that could be read, had learned Greek from a Byzantine prostitute, had written poems and amorous letters that would be attributed to others, had practically constructed a kingdom that now no one knew better than he and his friends, but he had not completed his studies. He consoled himself with the thought that studying in Paris had in itself been a great feat, considering that he had been born among cows. Then he recalled that in all likelihood students would be penniless youths like him, and not lords' sons, who had to learn to make war and not to read and write. In short, he didn't feel entirely satisfied. One day, Buandulino realized that in a month or so he would be 26, for he had left home at 13, and it was exactly 13 years that he had been away. He sensed something that we would call homesickness for his native land, only he, who had never experienced it, did not know what it was. So he thought he was feeling a desire to see his adoptive father again, and he decided to join him in Basel, where he had stopped as he was once more returning to Italy. Buandulino hadn't seen Frederick since the birth of the first son. While he was writing and rewriting the priest's letter, the emperor had done all sorts of things, slipping like an eel from north to south, eating and sleeping on horseback like his barbarian forefathers, and his palace was simply the place where he happened to be at that moment. In those years he had returned to Italy another 2 times. The second time, along the way, he had suffered an insult at Susa, where the citizens rebelled against him, obliging him to flee in secret and in disguise, because they were holding Beatrice hostage. Then the Susani let her go, having done her no harm, but he had cut a sorry figure and had sworn an oath against Susa. Nor did he rest when he came back across the Alps, because he had to make the German princes see reason. When Buandulino finally saw the emperor, he found him with a very grave expression. Buandulino understood that, on the one hand, Frederick was more and more concerned about the health of his older son, also named Frederick, and, on the other, about the situation in Lombardy. Agreed, he admitted, and I say this only to you. My governors and my viceroys and my tax collectors were not only demanding what was my due, but 7 times that. For every hearth they exacted every year 3 solidi of old coinage, and 24 old denarii for every mill that operated on navigable waters. From the fishermen they took away 1/3 of the catch, and if someone died without children the inheritance was confiscated. I should have paid attention to the complaints that reached me, I know, but I had other things on my mind. And now it seems that some months ago the Lombard communes formed a league, an anti-imperial league, you understand. And what was their first decision? To rebuild the walls of Milan. The Italian cities were turbulent and disloyal, yes, but a league was the formation of another res publica. Naturally, that league could not endure, given the way one city in Italy hated the next. It was not even to be thought, and yet it was still a vulnus for the empire's honor. Who was joining the league? According to rumor, in an abbey not far from Milan there had been a gathering of delegates from Cremona, Mantua, Bergamo, and perhaps also Piacenza and Parma, but that was unsure. The rumors did not stop there, however, they spoke of Venice, Verona, Padua, Vicenza, Treviso, Ferrara, and Bologna. Bologna, can you believe that? Frederick cried, pacing up and down in front of Buandulino. You remember, don't you? Thanks to me, their damned professors could make all the money they wanted with those double-damned students of theirs, without accounting to me or to the Pope, and now they're joining up with that league. Could anything be more shameless? And Pavia, that's all we need. And Lodi, Buandulino interjected, to say something outrageous. Lodi? Lodi, Barbarossa yelled, his face red as his beard, as if he were about to have a stroke. But according to the news I'm receiving, Lodi has already taken part in the meetings. I gave my heart's blood to protect them, that flock of sheep. Without me the Milanese would have leveled them to the ground every new season, and now they're hand in glove with their own murderers and plotting against their benefactor. But, dear father, Buandulino asked, why do you say, it seems, and, according to rumor? Don't you receive reliable news? Do you people who study in Paris lose all sense of how things proceed in this world? If there's a lead, there's a conspiracy. If there's a conspiracy, those who used to be on your side have turned traitor, and they tell you the exact opposite of what they're doing down there, so the last to know what they're doing will be the emperor, like husbands who have an unfaithful wife that everyone in the town knows about except them. He could hardly have chosen a worse example, because at that very moment Beatrice entered, having learned of dear Buandulino's arrival. Buandulino knelt to kiss her hand, without looking at her face. Beatrice hesitated a moment. Perhaps it seemed to her that, by showing no sign of intimacy and affection, she would betray embarrassment. Therefore she placed her other hand maternally on his head, mussing his hair, forgetting that a woman just over 30 could no longer act this way towards a man only a little younger than she. To Frederick it all seemed normal, he the father, she the mother, even if both adoptive. The one who felt out of place was Buandulino. That double contact, her nearness, which enabled him to catch the perfume of her dress as if it were that of her flesh, and the sound of her voice. Luckily in that position he could not look into her eyes, for he would immediately have blanched and fallen senseless to the floor, filled him with unbearable joy, but it was poisoned by the sensation that with this simple act of homage he was once again betraying his father. He would not have known how to take his leave if the emperor had not asked a favor of him, or given him an order, which was the same thing. To have a clearer view of the situation in Italy, trusting neither official messengers nor messenger officials, Frederick had decided to send down there a few trusted men, who knew the country, but were not immediately identifiable as imperials, so that they could sniff out the atmosphere and gather information not vitiated by treason. Buandulino liked the idea of escaping the embarrassment he felt at court, but a moment later he felt something else. He felt extraordinarily moved by the idea of seeing his old places, and he realized finally that this was the reason he had undertaken his journey. After moving through various cities, one day Buandulino, riding on and on, or, rather, bumping along on his mule, because he was passing himself off as a merchant, peacefully going from town to town, was attracted by those heights beyond which, after a good stretch of plain, he ought to be able to look at the Tanaro and reach, between stony fields and swamps, his native Frascetta. Even though in those days, when you left home, you left without thinking of ever returning, Buandulino felt at this moment a tingling in his veins, as, all of a sudden, he was seized by an eagerness to know if his old parents were still alive. Not only that, suddenly faces of other boys of the neighborhood came into his mind. Masulu Panizza, with whom he used to set traps for hares, and Porcelli, known as Gino, or was it Guini, known as Porcello, with whom, at first sight, they had thrown rocks at each other, Alaramo Scotchabarozzi, known as Bonehead, and Cutica of Cornento, from the days when they fished together in the Bormida. Good Lord, he said to himself, surely I'm not dying now, though they say that on the point of death you remember the things of your childhood so well. It was the eve of Christmas, but Buandulino didn't know that, because in the course of his journey he had lost track of the days. He was trembling with cold, on his equally frozen mule, but the sky was clear in the sunset light, clean, with a smell of snow already in the air. He recognized these places as if he had passed by the day before. He remembered how he once went into these hills with his father, to deliver 3 mules, toiling up paths that could wear out the legs even of a boy, so you can imagine driving reluctant animals up them. But they enjoyed the return, looking at the plain from above and taking their time on the way down. Buandulino remembered that, not very far from the flowing river, the plain for a short stretch humped into a hillock, and from the top of that knoll one time he had seen, piercing a milky shroud, the spires of some towns. Bergoglio along the river, then Rovereto, and, farther on, Gamondio, Marengo, and the Palea, the area of marshes, of gravel and scrub, at whose edges perhaps there still stood the hut of the good Gagliardo. But when he was on the hillock, he saw a different view, as if all around, on the hills and in the valleys, the air was clear, and only the plain before him was murky with foggy vapors, those grayish, misty clumps that every now and then assail you on the road, enveloping you until you can see nothing, then they pass you, and off they go whence they came. So now Buandulino said to himself, why, look at that, it could be August here, but over Frascetta the eternal fog rules, like the snow on the peaks of the Alps. Nor did this displease him, because one who is born in fog always feels at home in it. Gradually, however, as he descended towards the river, he realized that those vapors were not fog, but clouds of smoke that allowed glimpses of the fires that fed them. From the smoke and fires, Buandulino now understood that, in the plain beyond the river, around what had once been Rovereto, the town had overflowed into the countryside, and everywhere there was a sprouting, mushroom-like, of new houses, some of stone, others of wood, many still only half-built, and to the west you could make out the beginning of a girdle of walls, such as there had never been in those parts. And on the fires, in the freezing cold, pots were boiling, heating water, for, farther on, men were pouring it into holes filled with lime or perhaps mortar. Buandulino had seen the beginning of the construction of the new cathedral in Paris, on the island in the middle of the river, and now he recognized the machines and the scaffoldings that master masons use. Judging by what he knew of cities, he realized that over there people were about to bring one into existence from nothing, and it was a sight that, if you're lucky, you see once in a lifetime. Madness, he said to himself. You turn your back for a moment and they pull a trick like this on you, and he spurred his mule to reach the valley as quickly as possible. After crossing the river, on a big barge that transported stones of every kind and size, he stopped where some workers, on an unsteady scaffolding, were constructing a little wall, while others, from the ground, with a winch, were raising to those above some baskets of rubble. But it was a winch only after a manner of speaking, for a more crude contraption could hardly be imagined. Made of withes instead of sturdy stakes, it swayed constantly, and the two men on the ground made it spin. They were less concerned with pulling the rope than with controlling that menacingly wide sway of the baskets. Buandulino promptly said to himself, "There, it's obvious, the people from around here, when they do something, they do it either bad or worse. Just look, is this any way to work? If I were master here, I'd grab all of them by the seat of the pants and throw them in the Tanaro." Then he saw, a bit farther on, another group, supposedly constructing a loggia, with crudely hewn stones, beams clumsily finished, and capitals that seemed shaped by an animal. To hoist the construction material they had rigged up a kind of pulley, and Buandulino realized that, compared with this bunch, the men at the little wall were masters worthy of Como. He then stopped making comparisons as, proceeding a little farther, he saw others building the way children do when they play with mud, and they were putting the finishing touches, the last licks, you might say, on a construction similar to three others near it, made of mud and shapeless stones, with roofs of straw carelessly packed. Thus a sort of street was being born of hovels very ill-made, as if the workers were competing to see who could finish first before the holiday, with no regard for the rules of the art. As he tried to find his bearings in that multitude of crafts, Buandulino discovered a multitude of dialects, which showed how one collection of huts was being made by peasants of Salero, a twisted tower was the work of Monferrato people, that mortar was being stirred by the Pavesi, those planks were being sawed by men who until then had cut down trees in the Palea. But when he heard someone giving orders, or saw a band working properly, he heard Genoese spoken. Have I fallen into the midst of the construction of the Tower of Babel? Buandulino asked himself. Or into the Hibernia of Abdul, where those 72 sages have reconstructed the speech of Adam, putting all languages together, just as you mix water and clay, pitch and bitumen. But here they no longer speak the language of Adam and, though altogether they speak 72 languages, men of such different breeds, who as a rule would be hitting one another, they are all mixing in loving harmony. He had approached a group that was skillfully covering a construction of wooden beams, as if it were an abbatial church, using a windlass of great dimensions which was not moved by manpower but by the toil of a horse. Not oppressed by the collar still in use in some rural districts, that would constrict his throat, the animal pulled with great energy thanks to a comfortable harness. The workmen emitted sounds surely Genoese, and Buandulino addressed them at once in their vernacular, even if not in a manner sufficiently correct to hide the fact that he was not one of them. "What are you up to?" he asked, to open the conversation. And one of them, giving him a nasty look, said they were building a machine to scratch their cock. Now, since all the others started laughing and it was clear they were laughing at him, Buandulino, already in a temper from having to act the unarmed merchant on a mule, while in his baggage he kept, carefully wrapped in a bolt of cloth, his courtier's sword, replied in the Freshita dialect, which after all this time returned spontaneously to his lips, that he had no need of a machine because, as a rule, his prick, as respectable people called it, was regularly scratched by those sluts of their mothers. The Genoese didn't understand clearly the meaning of his words, but they guessed their intention. They abandoned their tasks, one grabbing a stone, another a pick, to form a semicircle around the mule. Fortunately, at that moment some other men were approaching, one of whom looked like a knight, and in a language half Frank and half Latin, half Provençal and half God knows what, he told the Genoese that the traveler spoke like a man of these parts, and so they were not to treat him as someone who had no right to pass this way. He had asked questions like a spy, the Genoese explained, and the knight replied that if the emperor did send spies, so much the better, because it was time he knew that a city had risen here, just to spite him. And then he said to Buandulino, "I've never seen you before, but you look like someone returning home. Have you come to join us?" "My lord," Buandulino replied with urbanity, "I was born in Freshetta, but I left it many years ago, and I knew nothing of all that is happening here. My name is Buandulino, son of Gagliardo Alari." Before he could finish speaking, from the group of newcomers an old man with white hair and beard raised a stick and began shouting, "Wicked, heartless liar, may lightning strike you. How dare you use the name of my poor son Buandulino, son of Gagliardo, here in person, and Alari too, who left his home so many years ago with a grand Alaman lord, and after all maybe was one who made monkeys dance because I never heard another word about my poor boy and after all this time he has to be dead, so my sainted wife and I have suffered these 30 years, for the greatest sorrow of our life, that was already miserable enough, but to lose a son is a sorrow no one can know unless he's suffered it himself." At which Buandulino cried, "Dear father, it's really you." His voice broke and tears came to his eyes, but they could not conceal a great happiness. Then he added, "And it hasn't been 30 years of suffering, because I left only 13 years ago, and you should be pleased because I've spent those years well, and now I'm somebody." The old man came over to the mule, looked carefully into Buandulino's face, and said, "Why, you're really you. Even if it was 30 years, that jackass look you've never lost, so you know what I have to say to you. Maybe you're now somebody, but you mustn't wrong your father, and if I said 30 years it's because to me it seemed 30, and in 30 years you could have sent news, you wretch. You're the ruin of our family. Get off that animal that you probably stole, and I'll break this stick over your head." He seized Buandulino by the boots, trying to pull him down from the mule, but the man who seemed the leader stepped between them. Come now, Gagliardo, you find your son again after 30 years. 13, Buandulino said, you shut up. The two of us will talk later. You find him after 30 years and in this situation you embrace and thank God, for God's sake. Buandulino had already dismounted and was about to fling himself into the arms of Gagliardo, who was now crying, when the lord who seemed the leader again stepped in and seized Buandulino by the collar. But if there's anyone here who has a score to settle, it's me. And who might you be? Buandulino asked. I'm Oberto del Foro, but you don't know that, and you probably don't remember anything. I was maybe 10 years old and my father deigned to visit yours, to see some calves that were for sale. I was dressed the way a gentleman's son should be, and my father didn't want me to go into the stable with him for fear I would get dirty. I was wandering around outside the house, and you were right after me, so dirty and ugly you looked like you'd come out of a dunghill. You faced me, looked at me, and asked me if I wanted to play a game. I stupidly said yes, and you gave me a shove that sent me into the pig's trough. When my father saw me in that state, he gave me a whipping because I had spoiled my new clothes. That may be, Buandulino said, but it happened 30 years ago. First of all, it was 13, and since then I've thought about it every day, because I've never been so humiliated in my life as I was that time, and, growing up, I kept telling myself that if I one day met the son of Gagliardo, I'd kill him. And you want to kill me now? Not now, no. On the contrary, because we're all here and we've almost finished constructing a city, to fight the emperor when he sets foot again in these parts, so obviously I don't have time to waste killing you. For 30 years, 13. For 13 years I've had this rage in my heart, and now, at this very moment, strangely enough, it's gone. Like they say, sometimes. Now don't try to be smart. Go and embrace your father. Then, if you apologize to me for that day, we can go to a place nearby where they're celebrating the completion of a building, and in these situations we draw from the keg of the best and, as our old folks used to say, we drink the night away. Buandulino found himself in a huge cellar. The city wasn't yet finished, and already the first tavern was open, in a cave that was all hogsheads and long wooden tables, full of fine mugs, and salami made with ass's meat, which, Buandulino explained to a horrified Nikitas, arrived looking like swollen wineskins. You pierce them with a knife, drop them in some oil and garlic to fry, and they are a delicacy. And that's why all those present were in high spirits, stinking and tipsy. Oberto del Foro announced the return of the son of Gagliardo Allari, and immediately some of the men threw themselves on Buandulino, punching his shoulders, as he first widened his eyes, surprised, then responded, in a whirl of recognitions that threatened never to end. Good lord, why you're Scotchabarozzi, and you're Cutica of Cornento, and who are you? No, don't tell me, I want to guess. You must be Squisciafici, and are you Ghini or Porcelli? No, he's Porcelli, the one who always threw stones at you. I was Gino Ghini, and to tell the truth I still am. The two of us used to go and slide on the ice in winter. Good Lord Jesus, it's true, you're Ghini. Weren't you the one who could sell anything, even the dung of your goats, like that time when you passed some off on a pilgrim as the ashes of San Buandulino? That's right, I did. In fact, now I'm a merchant. Talk about fate. Now look at him, try and say who he is. Why, it's Merlo. What was it I always used to say to you? You used to say, lucky Merlo, stupid as you are, you never take offense. Now, look at me, instead of taking, I've lost. And he held up his right arm, the hand missing. At the siege of Milan, 10 years ago. Yes, I was going to ask. As far as I know, the people of Gamondio, Bergoglio, and Marengo have always been for the emperor. So how is it you used to be for him and now you're building a city against him? They all started trying to explain, and the only thing Buandulino understood clearly was that around the old castle and the church of Santa Maria of Rovereto a city had risen, made up of people from the neighboring settlements, places like Gamondio, Bergoglio, and Marengo, but with whole families who had come from everywhere, from Rivalta Bormida, from Bassignana or Piovera, to build the houses they would then live in. So that since May 3 of them, Rodolfo Nebbia, Alaramo of Marengo, and Oberto del Foro had brought to Lodi, to the communes assembled there, the support of the new city, even if it existed, at that moment, more in their intentions than on the banks of the Tanaro. But they had all worked like animals, all summer and autumn, and the city was nearly ready to block the emperor's path, the day he came down again into Italy, as was his bad habit. What did they think they were blocking? Buandulino asked, slightly skeptical. He could simply skirt it. No, no, they answered, you don't know the emperor, imagine. A city that rises without his consent is an offense to be cleansed in blood. He'll be forced to lay siege to it. On this point they were right. They well knew Frederick's character. That's why you need solid walls and streets designed specially for warfare, and that's why we needed the Genoese, who are sailors, true, but they go to distant lands and build many new cities, and they know how it's done. But the Genoese aren't the kind to do something for nothing, Buandulino said. Who paid them? They paid. They've already given us a loan of 1,000 Genovese solidi, and they've promised another 1,000 for the coming year. And what do you mean by saying you make streets specially designed for warfare? Have Emanuele Trotti explained that to you? It was his idea. You speak. You're the Poliorcet. What's the Polior thing? This Trotti, who, like Oberto, had the air of a Miles, a knight, in other words, a vassal of a certain dignity, said, "A city must resist the enemy, prevent him from scaling the walls, but if unfortunately he does scale them, the city must still be ready to stand up to him, and break his neck. If the enemy, inside the walls, immediately finds a tangle of alleyways where he can slip in, you'll never catch him again. Some go here, some there, and after a while the defenders end up like a mouse. No, the enemy must find an open area under the walls, where he remains exposed long enough to be assailed by arrows and stones from around the corners and from the windows, and before he can move past that space, half of his forces will be done for." True, Nikitas sadly interjected, on hearing the story, this is what they should have done in Constantinople. Instead, at the base of the walls they allowed that tangle of alleyways to develop. Yes, Buandulino would have liked to reply, but you'd also need men with balls like my countrymen, and not a bunch of namby-pambys like your weak-kneed imperial guard. But he remained silent so as not to hurt his interlocutor, and he said, "Be quiet, don't interrupt Trotti, let me continue." Trotti said, "If the enemy then gets past the open area and slips into the streets, they should not be straight, made with a plumb line, not even if you are inspired by the ancient Romans, who designed a city on a grid. Because with a straight street the enemy always knows what's awaiting him, but not if the streets are full of corners, or elbows, if you like. The defender waits around the corner, on the ground and on the rooftops, and he always knows what the enemy is doing, because on the next roof there's another defender, crouching on a corner, who glimpses the enemy and signals to those who haven't yet seen him. The enemy never knows what's in store for him, so he slows down his advance. Therefore a good city must have its houses badly arranged, like a crone's teeth, which seems ugly but is what's really beautiful. And, finally, you want the false tunnel. You haven't told us about that yet," Boidi interjected. "Naturally. I just heard about it myself from a Genoese who heard it from a Greek, and it was an idea of Belisarius, the general of the Emperor Justinian. What does a besieger want? He wants to dig tunnels under the walls that will lead him to the heart of the city. So what is his dream? To find a tunnel already made. So we promptly dig a tunnel for him, which from outside leads inside the walls. On the outside, we conceal the mouth of the tunnel with rocks and bushes, but not cleverly enough to prevent the enemy from discovering it sooner or later. The end of the tunnel, the one that opens inside the city, must be a passage so narrow that only one man, or at most two, can go through at a time. It is closed with a metal grating, and the first one to reach it will see a square and perhaps the corner of a chapel, a sign that the passage leads right into the city. At the grating you set a guard, and when the enemy arrives, they have to emerge one by one, and as each comes out, the guard fells him. And the enemy are all stupid and they keep coming out, not noticing that those ahead of them are dropping like figs," Boidi snickered. "Who says enemies are stupid? Calm down. Maybe the idea should be studied a bit more, but it isn't something to reject." Buandulino stepped to one side with Ghini, who was a merchant and must therefore be a man of sense with his feet on the ground, not like those knights, vassals of vassals, who'd achieve military fame fleeing themselves even into lost causes. "Listen to me a minute, Ghini, pass me that wine and tell me something. I'll go along with the idea that, when you make a city here, Barbarossa is forced to besiege it to save his reputation, and that gives time to those of the League to strike him from behind after he's worn himself out with the siege. But the losers in all this are the people of the city. You'd have me believe that our people will leave the places where, for better or worse, they were getting along, and come here to get themselves killed to please the people of Pavia? You're telling me that the Genoese, who wouldn't shell out a penny to ransom their mothers from the Saracen pirates, are giving you money and labor to build a city that, at best, serves the purposes of Milan?" "Buandulino," Ghini said, "the story is much more complicated than that. Take a good look at where we are." He dipped a finger in the wine and began to make marks on the table. "Here's Genoa, right? And here are Terdona, then Pavia, then Milan. These are rich cities, and Genoa is a port. So Genoa must have free access for its trade with the Lombard cities, right? The passes go through the Lemmi Valley, then the Orba Valley, the Bormida, and the Scrivia. We're talking about 4 rivers, aren't we? And they all intertwine more or less along the shore of the Tanaro. So if you have a bridge over the Tanaro, from there your way is open to trade with the lands of the Marquis of Monferrato, and God knows where else. Is that clear? Now, while Genoa and Pavia were getting along nicely, it was fine for them if these valleys remained without a lord, or else, if the situation demanded, they formed alliances, for example, with Gavi or with Marengo, and things went smoothly. But with the arrival of this emperor, Pavia on one side and Monferrato on the other, both allied with the empire, Genoa is cut off to the left and also to the right, and if it goes over to Frederick, it can kiss its trade with Milan goodbye. So they have to remain on good terms with Terdona and Novi, since one will allow them to control the valley of the Scrivia and the other, the Bormida. But you know what happened. The emperor raised Terdona, Pavia seized control of the Terdona region as far as the Apennines, and all our towns went over to the empire, and, by God, I ask you, puny as we were, could we have tried acting strong? What did the Genoese have to give us to persuade us to change sides? Something we'd never dreamed of having. Namely, a city, with consuls and soldiers, and a bishop, and walls, a city that collects tolls on transients and goods. You realize, Buandulino, that just by controlling a bridge over the Tanaro you make piles of money. You sit there comfortably and you ask money of one man, a couple of hens from the next, a whole ox from the one after that, and they pay up right away. A city is a gold mine. Remember how rich the people of Terdona were compared to us in the Palea. And this city, which is good for us, is good also for the League and good for Genoa, as I was telling you, because, weak as it might be, by the mere fact of being there, it disrupts the schemes of all the others and guarantees that in this area neither Pavia nor the Emperor can be master, nor can the Marquis of Monferrato. Yes, but then Barbarossa comes along and squashes you like a bug. Just a moment, who says so? The problem is that when he arrives, the city is already there. Then you know well what happens. A siege costs time and money, we make a fine show of submission, he's happy, because with such people it's honor above all, and he goes off somewhere else. But the League people and the Genoese have thrown their money away to build the city, and you tell them to go screw themselves? It depends on when Barbarossa arrives. As you can see, in the space of 3 months these cities change their allegiance like it was nothing. We sit and wait. Maybe at that moment the League is allied with the Emperor. Master Nikitas, Buandulino said, I swear by my own eyes, 6 years later, at the siege of the city, there were Genoese slingers. You understand? Genoese. The ones who had helped build it. Otherwise, Guini continued, we face the siege. Damn it to hell, in this world you get nothing for nothing. Enough of this talk, come and see. He took Buandulino by the hand and led him out of the tavern. Evening had fallen, and it had turned colder. They came out into a little square, from which, it seemed, at least 3 streets should lead, but only 2 corners were built, with low houses, a single story, the roofs of straw. The little square was illuminated by lights coming from the surrounding windows, and by a few braziers kept burning by vendors, who were crying, hey, you women. Hey, the holy night is beginning and you surely don't want your husband not to find something tasty on the table. Near what would become the third corner was a knife grinder, who made the knives squeak as he sprinkled the wheel. Farther on, at a stand, a woman was selling chickpea flour, dried figs, and carobs, and a shepherd wearing a fleece jacket held a little basket. Right here, ladies. Good fresh cheese, he shouted. In an empty space between 2 houses, 2 men were discussing the sale of a pig. In the background, a pair of girls were lazily leaning against a door, their teeth chattering, their shawls allowing a glimpse of an ample low-cut bodice. One of them said to Buandulino, what a pretty boy you are. Why don't you come spend Christmas with me, and I'll teach you how to make the beast with 8 paws. They turned the corner and found a wool carter, crying in a loud voice that this was their last chance for mattresses and piluses, to sleep warm, and not freeze like the baby Jesus, and next to him a waterman was shouting, and as they continued along the streets, still roughly laid out, they could see doorways where a carpenter was working his plane, and over there a smith striking his anvil in a festival of sparks, and farther on another man taking loaves from an oven that glowed like the mouth of hell. And merchants were arriving from afar to do business on this new frontier, also people who usually lived in the forest. Charcoal burners, honey gatherers, peddlers of ashes for soap, collectors of bark for making cord or tanning leather, vendors of rabbit skins, jailbird faces who. They turned the corner and found a wool carter, crying in a loud voice that this was their last chance for mattresses and piluses, to sleep warm, and not freeze like the baby Jesus, and next to him a waterman was shouting, and as they continued along the streets, still roughly laid out, they could see doorways where a carpenter was working his plane, and over there a smith striking his anvil in a festival of sparks, and farther on another man taking loaves from an oven that glowed like the mouth of hell. And merchants were arriving from afar to do business on this new frontier, also people who usually lived in the forest. Charcoal burners, honey gatherers, peddlers of ashes for soap, collectors of bark for making cord or tanning leather, vendors of rabbit skins, jailbird faces who assembled in the new settlement thinking they would find profit there, and the blind and the halt and the maimed and the scrofulous, for whom begging in the streets of a town, and during the holy holidays, promised to be richer than wandering along the deserted roads of the countryside.
Continued along the streets, still roughly laid out, they could see doorways where a carpenter was working his plane, and over there a smith striking his anvil in a festival of sparks, and farther on another man taking loaves from an oven that glowed like the mouth of hell. And merchants were arriving from afar to do business on this new frontier, also people who usually lived in the forest. Charcoal burners, honey gatherers, peddlers of ashes for soap, collectors of bark for making cord or tanning leather, vendors of rabbit skins, jailbird faces who assembled in the new settlement thinking they would find profit there, and the blind and the halt and the maimed and the scrofulous, for whom begging in the streets of a town, and during the holy holidays, promised to be richer than wandering along the deserted roads of the countryside.
The first snowflakes were beginning to fall. They grew thicker, and for the first time there was a layer of white on those young roofs, though no one could know if they were capable of bearing the weight. At a certain point Buandulino, remembering his invention in conquered Milan, opened his eyes wide. 3 merchants entering on 3 asses through an arch in the wall seemed to him to be the Magi. They were followed by their servants, carrying pots and precious stuffs. Behind them, beyond the Tanaro, he thought he could make out some flocks descending the slopes of the Silvered Hill, the shepherds playing bagpipes, and caravans of oriental camels with Moors wearing great varicolour striped turbans. On the hill sparse fires were dying under the twinkling snow, more persistent now, but to Buandulino one of them seemed a great caudate star, which moved in the sky towards the city that was wailing in birth pangs. You see what a city is? Guini said to him. And if it's like this before it's even finished, imagine what will happen afterwards. It's another life. Every day you see new people. For the merchants, just think, it's like having the heavenly Jerusalem. For the knights, since the emperor forbade them to sell lands so as not to divide the fief, and they were bored to death in the countryside, now they command companies of bowmen, they ride out in parades, they give orders left and right. But things don't prosper just for the gentry and the merchants. It's a providence also for a man like your father, who doesn't have much land but has some livestock, and people arrive in the city and ask him for stock and pay cash. They're beginning to sell for ready money and not through barter. I don't know if you understand what that means. If you exchange 2 chickens for 3 rabbits, sooner or later you have to eat them, otherwise they grow too old, whereas 2 coins you can hide under your mattress and they're good 10 years from now, and if you're lucky they stay there even if enemies come into your house. Besides, it's happened in Milan and in Lodi and Pavia, and it will also happen here with us. It's not that the Guineas or the Aleris have to keep their mouths shut and only the Guiscos or the Trottis give the orders. We're all part of those who make the decisions. Here you can become important even if you're not a noble, and this is the fine thing about a city, and it's specially fine for one who isn't noble, and is ready to get himself killed, if he really has to, but it's better not, because his sons can go around saying, "My name is Guinea, and even if your name is Trotti, you're still shit." Obviously, at this point Nikitas asked Buandulino what this city was called. What a talent that Buandulino had as a storyteller, having kept that revelation in suspense until this moment. The city didn't yet have a name, except a generic Civitas Nova, which was a genus name, not an individuum. The choice of name would depend on another question, and no small one: legitimation. How does a new city, without history and without nobility, gain the right to exist? Ideally by imperial investiture, just as the emperor can create a knight or a baron, but here we were dealing with a city born against the emperor's wishes. So, Buandulino and Guinea went back to the tavern, as all there were debating that very question. If this city is born outside the imperial law, it can only become legitimate through some other law, just as strong and ancient. And where will we find that? Why, in the Constitutum Constantini, in the donation that the Emperor Constantine made to the Church, giving it the right to govern territories. We donate the city to the Pope and, seeing that at this moment there are 2 popes around, we donate it to the one who is siding with the League, that is to say, Alexander III. As we said before at Lodi, months ago, the city will be called Alessandria, and it will be a papal fief. First of all, at Lodi you should have kept quiet, because we hadn't yet decided anything, Boidi said, but that's not the point. As names go, it's a beautiful name, or at least it's no uglier than a lot of others. But what sticks in my craw is that here we bust our behinds to make a city and then we present it to the Pope, who already has so many. And that way we'll have to pay him tribute, and any way you look at it, it's still money that we lose, so we might as well be paying the emperor. Boidi, don't be dumb, as usual, Kutika said to him. First, the emperor doesn't want the city, not even if they make him a present of it, and if he was ready to accept it, then it wasn't worth it. Second, it's one thing not to pay taxes to the emperor, who then comes and chops you to pieces, as he did with Milan, and it's another thing not to pay them to the Pope, who's 1,000 miles away and, with all the problems he has, he's not likely to send an army just to collect small change. Third, Buandulino spoke up. If you'll allow me to express an opinion, I've studied in Paris and I have some experience of how you make letters and diplomas. There are all sorts of ways of making presents. You draw up a document that says Alessandria is being founded in honor of Alexander the Pope and consecrated to St. Peter, for example. As proof, you build a cathedral to St. Peter on allodial land, which has no feudal obligations. And you build it with money contributed by all the people of the city. After which you make a gift of it to the Pope, with all the formulas that your notaries find most suitable and most binding. You flavor it with expressions of filial devotion and all those things, you send the parchment to the Pope, and you receive all his benedictions. Anybody who later scrutinizes that document will see that, in the final analysis, you've given him only the cathedral and not the rest of the city, and I can't see a Pope coming here to take away his cathedral and carry it to Rome. It sounds magnificent to me, Oberto said, and all agreed. We'll do what Buandulino says, as he seems to me very clever and I really hope he'll stay here to give us more good advice, since he's also a grand Paris scholar. Here Buandulino had to resolve the most embarrassing part of that fine day. Namely, reveal, without anyone being able to reproach him, since they too had been imperials until a short time past, that he was a ministerial of Frederick, to whom he was bound by filial affection, and then to tell the whole story of those 13 wondrous years, while Gagliardo did nothing but murmur. If they would have told me, I'd never believe it, and, just think, he looked like a worse fool than the others, and here he really is somebody. Not all ills come to harm, Boidi said then. Alessandria isn't yet finished, and we already have one of us at the imperial court. Dear Buandulino, you mustn't betray your emperor, since you love him so much, and he loves you. But you will remain at his side and stand up for us whenever necessary. This is the land where you were born and nobody can blame you if you try to defend it, within the limits of loyalty, of course. Still, for tonight it would be best if you went to see that sainted woman your mother and slept at Frascetta, Oberto said delicately, and tomorrow you leave, without staying here to see how the streets are made and how thick the walls are. We're sure that, out of love for your natural father, if you were to learn one day that we were in great danger, you would send us word. But if you have the heart to do this, who knows? Maybe for the same reason one day you would not warn your adoptive father of some machination of ours too painful for him. In any case, the less you know, the better. Yes, my son, Gagliardo said then, after all the troubles you've caused me, do at least this one good thing. I have to stay here, because, as you see, we're discussing serious matters, but don't leave your mother alone on this night, for if she sees you, in her great joy she won't see anything else, and she won't notice that I'm not there. Go, and I'll tell you something else. You even have my blessing, for God only knows when we'll see each other again. Very well, Buandulino said. In a single day I find a city and I lose it. Oh, son of a bitch. Do you realize, if I want to see my father again, I'll have to come and lay siege to him? Asterisk. That, Buandulino explained to Nikitas, was more or less what happened. On the other hand, there was no way of doing it differently, a sign that those were truly difficult times. And then? Nikitas asked. I set out to find my house. The snow on the ground came up to my knees, what fell from the sky was now a chaos that made your eyeballs spin and slashed your face. The fires of the Civitas Nova had disappeared, and between the white below and the white above I couldn't figure out what direction to take. I thought I could remember the old paths, but at this point there weren't any paths, and you couldn't tell what was solid ground and what was swamp. Obviously, to build the houses, they had cut down entire groves and I could no longer find even the shapes of those trees that once I had known by heart. I was lost, like Frederick the night he met me, only now it was snow and not fog, for if it had been fog, I'd still have found my way. Fine thing, Buandulino, I said to myself, you get lost on your own ground. My mama was right to say that those who can read and write are stupider than those who can't, and now what do? Do I stop here and eat my mule, or tomorrow morning, after they dig and dig, will they find me looking like a rabbit's skin left out overnight in the heart of winter? If Buandulino was there to tell the story, it meant that he survived, but through a near miracle. Because while he was proceeding, without direction, he glimpsed once again a star in the sky, very pale, but still visible, and he followed it, until he realized he was in a low valley and the star seemed high because he was low, but once he climbed the slope, the light grew ever brighter before him, until he realized that it came from one of those sheds where they keep the livestock when there isn't enough room in the house. In the shed was a cow, and a frightened ass braying, a woman with her hands between the legs of a sheep, and the sheep producing a lamb, bleeding its heart out. He stopped on the threshold to wait for the lamb to emerge, before he kicked the ass out of the way, and rushed to lay his head in the woman's lap, crying, "Dearest mother." For a moment the woman was stunned, then she pulled up his head, turning it towards the fire, and she started to cry, stroking his hair and murmuring between her sighs, "O Lord, 2 lambs in a single night, one being born and the other coming back from the devil's own land. It's like having Christmas and Easter together, but it's too much for my poor heart. Hold me, I'm about to faint." "That's enough, Buandulino. I've heated water in the pot to wash this poor little creature. Can't you see you're getting blood all over you? But where did you get those clothes that look like a gentleman's? You haven't stolen them, have you, you rascal?" For Buandulino it was as if he heard angels singing. 14. Buandulino saves Alessandria with his father's cow. "And so, to see your father again you had to besiege him?" Nikitas said, towards evening, as he invited his guest to taste some sweets of yeast flour, shaped to look like flowers or plants or other objects. "Not exactly. The siege was 6 years later. After witnessing the birth of the city, I went back to Frederick and told him what I had seen. Before I had even finished speaking, he was already in a roaring fury. He shouted that a city is born only with the emperor's consent, and if it's born without that consent it must be razed before they can finish building it, otherwise anyone can grant consent in place of the emperor, and that spelled the end of the nomen imperi. Then he calmed down, but I knew him well, he wouldn't forgive. Luckily, for about 6 years he was occupied with other matters. He entrusted me with various missions, including that of sounding out the intentions of the Alessandrians. So I went twice to Alessandria to see if my fellow citizens wanted to concede anything. In fact, they were ready to concede a great deal, but the truth is that Frederick wanted only one thing. The city had to disappear into the vacuum from which it had come. You can imagine the Alessandrians. I don't dare repeat to you what they told me to say to him. I realized that those journeys were only a pretext to spend as little time as possible at court, because it was a source of constant suffering to meet the empress and to maintain my vow. "Which you did maintain?" Nikitas asked, almost as an affirmation. "Which I did maintain, and forever, Master Nikitas. I may be a counterfeiter of parchments, but I know what honor is." She helped me. Motherhood had transformed her. Or at least that was the impression she wanted to give, and I never understood what she felt for me. I suffered, and yet I was grateful to her for the way she helped me behave with dignity. Buandulino by now was over 30, and tempted to consider the Prester John letter a youthful caprice, a fine exercise in epistolary rhetoric, a jocus, a ludibrium. He had found the poet again, who, after the death of Reynald, had remained without a patron, and you know what happens at court in such cases. You're no longer worth anything, and there are those who start saying your poems were never all that great. Gnawed by bitterness and rancor, the poet had spent some ill-considered years in Pavia, resuming the only activities in which he shone, namely, drinking and reciting the poems of Buandulino. Especially one verse, prophetic, that when quis papi de morens castus habeatur, can he who lives in Pavia be chaste? Buandulino brought his friend back to court, and in his company the poet appeared as one of Frederick's men. Further, the poet's father had died meanwhile, he had come into his inheritance, and even the enemies of the deceased Reynald no longer saw him as a parasite, but as another Miles, and no more dissipated than the others. Together, they relived the days of the letter, each complimenting the other on that great achievement. Considering a game as a game does not mean ceasing to play it. Buandulino still felt a yearning for the kingdom he had never seen, and from time to time, alone, he would recite the letter to himself, aloud, continuing to perfect the style. Asterisk. The proof that I couldn't forget the letter is that I managed to convince Frederick to invite my Parisian friends to court, all of them together, telling him that in the chancellery of an emperor it was good to have people who were familiar with other countries, their languages and their customs. To be truthful, since Frederick was employing me more and more as a confidential messenger in various situations, I wanted to create my little personal court, the poet, Abdul, Boran, Kayat, and Rabbi Solomon. You don't mean to tell me the emperor brought a Jew to his court? Why not? He didn't have to appear in the great ceremonies or go to mass with him and his archbishops. If the princes of all Europe and the Pope himself have Jewish physicians, why not keep at hand a Jew who knew the life of the Moors in Spain and many other things about the countries of the Orient? Besides, the Germanic princes have always been more clement towards the Hebrews, more than all the other Christian kings. As Otto told me, when Edessa was reconquered by the infidels and many Christian princes again took up the cross, following the preaching of Bernard de Clairvaux, and that was when Frederick himself took up the cross, a monk by the name of Radulf incited the pilgrims to slaughter all the Jews in the cities they passed through. And it was truly a massacre. But many Jews sought the emperor's protection, and he allowed them to take refuge and live in the city of Nuremberg. In short, Buandulino was reunited with all his cronies. Not that, at court, they had much to do. Solomon, in every city through which Frederick passed, got in touch with his fellow Jews, and they were to be found everywhere. Like weeds, the poet taunted him. Abdul discovered that the Provençal of his songs was understood better in Italy than in Paris. Boran and Kayat wore themselves out in dialectical battles. Boran tried to convince Kayat that the non-existence of the vacuum was crucial in establishing the uniqueness of the Grazel. Kayat obstinately believed that it was a stone fallen from the heavens, lapis excelsis, and as far as he was concerned it could even have arrived from another universe, crossing totally empty spaces. Apart from these weaknesses, they often discussed the letter of the priest, and Buandulino's friends asked why he didn't press Frederick to make the journey they had worked so hard to prepare. One day, as Buandulino was trying to explain that, in those years, Frederick had too many problems still to be resolved, both in Lombardy and in Germany, the poet said that perhaps it would be worthwhile for them to go off themselves in search of the kingdom, without awaiting the emperor's convenience. The emperor could draw some dubious advantage from this enterprise. Suppose he reaches the land of John and does not come to an agreement with that monarch. He would return defeated, and we would have done him only harm. On the other hand, if we go on our own, however things turn out, we will surely return from such a rich and miraculous land with something extraordinary. That's the truth, Abdul said. What are we waiting for? Let's set out, it is a long way. Master Nikitas, I felt sick at heart, as I saw them seized by the poet's proposal, and I understood why. Both Boran and Kayat were hoping to find the kingdom of the priest in order to take possession of the Grazel, which would have given them God knows what glory and power in those northern lands where all were still searching for it. Rabbi Solomon would find the 10 lost tribes, and would become the greatest and most honored, not only among the rabbis of Spain, but among all the sons of Israel. In the case of Abdul, there was little to say. He had by now identified the kingdom of Prester John as that of his princess, except that, growing in age and wisdom, distance satisfied him less and less, while the princess, may the god of lovers forgive him, was someone he wanted to be able to put his hands on. As for the poet, who knows what he had been brooding over in Pavia? Now, with a modest fortune of his own, he seemed to want John's kingdom for himself, not for the emperor. This explains why for some years, in my disappointment, I didn't speak to Frederick of the priest's kingdom. If this was the game, it was better to leave that kingdom where it was, saving it from the desires of those who failed to understand its mystical greatness. The letter had thus become my personal dream, and I no longer wanted anyone else to enter it. I needed it to quell the sufferings of my unhappy love. One day, I told myself, I will forget all this because I will move towards the land of Prester John. But now we should return to the affairs of Lombardy. In the days of Alessandria's birth, Frederick had said that if Pavia were to go over to his enemies, that would be the last straw. And 2 years later Pavia did choose the anti-imperial league. It was a bitter blow for the emperor. He did not react at once, but in the course of the following years the situation in Italy became so murky that Frederick resolved to return, and it was clear to all that he was aiming precisely at Alessandria. Forgive me, Nikitas said, so he was going back into Italy for the 3rd time? No, the 4th. Wait, let me remember. It must have been the 5th, I think. Sometimes he stayed, maybe for 4 years, like that time of Crema and the destruction of Milan. Or had he gone back in the meantime? No, he spent more time in Italy than at his own home, but what was his home? Accustomed as he was to traveling, he felt at home, I had realized, only along the banks of a river. He was a good swimmer, the cold never frightened him, or deep water, or whirlpools. He flung himself into the water, swam, and he seemed to feel he was in his own element. In any case, the time I'm now talking about, he went down very angry, ready for a hard war. With him was the Marquis of Monferrato, as well as the cities of Alba, Acqui, Pavia, and Como. But you just said that Pavia had gone over to the League? Did I? Oh, yes, before. But in the meantime it had come back to the Emperor. Oh, Lord, Nikitas cried, our emperors dig each other's eyes out, but at least, as long as they see, we know whose side they're on. You people have no imagination. Anyway, in September of that year Frederick descended, through the Mont Cenis pass to Susa. The affront he had suffered 7 years earlier was not forgotten, and he put the town to the sword and burned it. Asti surrendered at once, giving him free passage, and there he was encamped in Frascetta, along the Bormida, but he had deployed other men all around, even beyond the Tanaro. It was time to settle scores with Alessandria. I received letters from the poet, who had followed the expedition, and it seems that Frederick was breathing flame and fire, and felt he was the very incarnation of divine justice. Why weren't you with him? Because he was good, truly. He realized the anguish I could feel at witnessing the severe punishment he was going to inflict on the people of my land, and with some pretext he urged me to stay far away until Rovereto was nothing but a heap of ashes. You understand? He didn't call it Civitas Nova or Alessandria, because a new city, without his permission, couldn't exist. So he spoke of the old place, Rovereto, as if it had only expanded a little. This was early November, but November, in that plain, meant deluge. It rained, and even the cultivated fields became swamp. The Marquis of Monferrato had assured Frederick that those walls were of earth, and behind them were some strays who would shed green at the very name of the emperor, but instead those vagabonds proved good defenders, and the walls turned out to be so solid that the cats, the imperial rams, broke their horns against them. The horses and the soldiers wallowed in the mud, and the besieged at one point deviated the course of the Bormida, so the best of the Alaman cavalry was in mud up to its neck. Finally, the Alessandrians sent out a machine like the one seen at Crema. A scaffolding of wood that clung well to the ramparts, and projected a very long gangway, a slightly tilted bridge that permitted them to dominate the enemy beyond the walls. And along that gangway they rolled barrels filled with dry wood, impregnated with oil, lard, suet, and liquid pitch, to which they set fire. The barrels moved very fast, and they fell on the imperial machines, or else on the ground, where they resumed rolling like balls of fire, until they reached another machine and set fire to it. At that point the besiegers' greatest task was transporting kegs of water to put out the fires. There was no lack of water, with the rivers, the swamp, and the water pouring down from heaven, but if all the soldiers were carrying water, who would kill the enemy? The emperor had decided to devote the winter to reordering his army, because it is hard to attack walls when you're sliding on ice or sinking into the snow. Unfortunately that February was very severe, the army was disheartened, and the emperor even more so. Frederick, who had subjugated Terdona, Crema, and even Milan, ancient cities well trained in the arts of war, was helpless against a mass of hovels that was a city only by miracle, and housed people that came from only God knew where. And only God knew why they were so attached to those walls, which, in any case, had never belonged to them. Kept at a distance to prevent his seeing the destruction of his people, Buandulino decided to go to those places for fear that his people might harm the emperor. So here he was, facing the plain where stood the city he had seen in its cradle, all bristling with banners sporting a great red cross on a white ground, as if the inhabitants wanted to muster their courage by displaying, newly born as they were, the quarterings of an ancient nobility. Facing the walls was a mushrooming field of cats, pulleys, catapults, and, among them, drawn by horses in front and pushed by men behind, 3 towers advanced, teeming with rowdy people, shaking their weapons at the walls as if to say, "Here we come." Accompanying the towers, he saw the poet, riding along with the mien of one making sure that everything is being done properly. "Who are those madmen on the towers?" Buandulino asked. "Genoese crossbowmen," the poet replied, "the most fearsome assault troops in a well-ordered siege." "The Genoese?" Buandulino was dumbfounded, but they helped found the city. The poet laughed and said that in the mere 4 or 5 months since he had arrived in these parts, he had seen more than one city change its allegiance. In October, Terdona had sided with the communes, then saw that Alessandria was holding out too well against the emperor, and the Tetuansi began to suspect that the city could become too strong, and a good number of them were now insisting that their city should go over to Frederick. Cremona, at the time of Milan's surrender, was with the empire. In recent years it had passed to the League, but now for some mysterious reason of its own, it was dealing with the Imperials. And how is the siege going? It's proceeding badly. Either those inside the walls are defending themselves well or else we don't know how to attack. If you ask me, the mercenaries Frederick has brought with him this time are worn out. You can't trust them, they run off at the first difficulty. Many deserted this winter, only because it was cold and yet they were Flemings, so they didn't come from Hic-Saint-Leons. Finally, in the camp they're dying like flies, of 1,000 diseases, and inside the walls I don't believe they're any better off, because they must have run out of provisions. Buandulino at last presented himself to the emperor. "I've come here, dear father," he said, "because I know these places and I could be of use to you." "Yes," Barbarossa replied, "but you also know the people, and you won't want any harm done to them. And you know me. If you don't trust my heart, you know you can trust my words. I will not harm my people, but I will not lie to you. On the contrary, You will lie to me, but you won't do me any harm either. You will lie and I'll pretend to believe you because you always lie for good ends. He was a rough man, Buandulino explained to Nikitas, but capable of great subtlety. Can you understand what I felt then? I didn't want to destroy that city, but I loved him and I wanted his glory. You had only to convince yourself, Nikitas said, that his glory would have shone even more if you were to spare the city. God bless you, Master Nikitas, it's as if you read my soul at that time. This was the idea in my head as I moved back and forth between the camps and the walls. I had made it clear to Frederick that obviously I would establish some contact with the natives, as if I were a kind of ambassador, but evidently it wasn't clear to all that I could move without arousing any suspicion. At court some people envied my familiarity with the emperor, the Bishop of Spire, for example, and a certain Count Diepold, whom everyone called the Bishopess, perhaps because he had the blonde hair and rosy cheeks of a maiden. Perhaps he didn't give himself to the bishop. In fact he always talked about his Tekla, whom he had left behind up there in the north. Who knows? He was handsome, but, happily, he was also stupid. It was those two who set their spies, even there in the camp, to follow me and then went and told the emperor that the night before I had been seen riding towards the walls and talking with people of the city. Fortunately the emperor sent them to the devil, because he knew I went towards the walls in the daytime and not at night. So Buandulino did go to the walls, and even inside the walls. The first time was not easy because as he trotted towards the gates, he heard the whistle of a stone, a sign that in the city they were beginning to save their arrows and were using slingshots, which since the time of David had proved effective and cheap. He had to shout in pure Freshita dialect, making broad gestures with his weaponless arms, and fortunately he was recognized by Trotty. "Oh Buandulino," Trotty shouted down at him, "are you coming to join us?" "Don't play the fool, Trotty, you already know I'm on the other side. But I'm surely not here with bad intentions. Let me come in. I want to speak to my father. I swear on the Virgin that I won't say a word about what I may see. I trust you. Open the gates, down there. Did you hear me, or are all of you weak in the head? This is a friend, or almost. I mean he's with them, but he's one of ours. He's one of us, but he's one of theirs. Hey, just open the gates or I'll kick your teeth in." All right, those wide-eyed fighters said. "No telling here who's in and who's out. Yesterday the man went out dressed like a pavese." "Shut your mouth, you animal," Trotty shouted. And, ha ha. Buandulino laughed as he entered. "You've sent spies to our camp. Don't worry, I told you. I won't see anything or hear anything." And now Buandulino is embracing Gagliardo, still vigorous and as if strengthened by enforced fasting, near the well of the little square just inside the walls. Then he finds Ghini and Scotchabarozzi opposite the church, and when he asks where Squishafici is, they weep and tell him that Squishafici took a Genoese dart in the throat in the last attack, and Buandulino also weeps, for he has never liked war and now less than ever, and he fears for his old father. Here is Buandulino in the beautiful main square, bright in the pale March sunshine. He sees children carrying big baskets of stones to reinforce the defenses, and skins of water for the sentries, and he is proud of the indomitable spirit that has gripped the citizens. Here's Buandulino wondering who all these people are crowding into Alessandria as if for a wedding feast, and his friends tell him that this is their great misfortune, that fear of the imperial army has brought here people fleeing all the surrounding villages, and, yes, the city has many hands, but also too many mouths to feed. Here is
Buandulino admiring the new cathedral, which may not be big but is well made, and he says, "Why, it even has a tympanum with a dwarf on the throne, and around him they say,